Los Angeles, 1937. There are lots of guys like J.J. Gittes. They're easy to find, if you want to find them.
Mr. Gittes, have we ever met?
Well, no.
Never?
Never.
Since you agree with me that we've never met before, you must also agree with me that I've never hired you to do anything, certainly not spy on my husband. I don't get tough with anyone, Mr. Gittes. My lawyer does.
It's ticklish business any way you look at it. Come on, we'll stick together.
Hello, everybody, and welcome back to Ticklish Business. As always, I'm Kristen Lopez, joined by the lovely and amazing Emily Edwards. Emily, how are you?
I'm very well. This is going to be a really, really good one.
Yeah, we are celebrating the 50th anniversary of 1974's Chinatown and talking about it, along with our love of LA noirs. And joining us is a non-LA native, but we are considering him one anyway. Film critic, one half of Ebert and Roeper, Richard Roeper. How are you, Richard?
Hi, Kristen. Hi, Emily. It's so good to talk to you guys. You know, I was hoping actually that it was going to be raining here in Chicago when I talk to you guys, you know, because it's so funny you mentioned that because I'm in LA a lot, you know, but in Chicago, every time I walk around Chicago, if it's like kind of around dusk and it starts to rain, I start taking pictures of the streets because I think, ooh, even if it's Stan's Donuts, all of a sudden it looks like very murdery and double.
Right?
And the other thing, Kristen, you just blew my mind because I was thinking when you reached out to me, I'm like, oh yeah, Chinatown. And 50 years? Because I keep thinking, oh, that was like 25 years ago. That was 30 years ago. 50 years ago. Jeez.
50. Yeah, Emily and I were just talking the other day about how 1985 is going to be 40 next year. And yeah, it's...
Yes, I am.
Well, you know, it's interesting. I was just writing a piece recently about the summer of '94, as you guys well know, 1994, one of the legendary movies of all time. But you know, you think because every couple of weeks, you know, there was something coming out, and then in the fall, it was Pulp Fiction and Shawshank were out. I think within about 2 or 3 weeks. So there was a time where you could walk up to a movie theater, cashier, and said like one for Shawshank, and then maybe sneak over and see Pulp Fiction at the same time. Incredible.
Well, it's amazing, too. We're talking about this episode. TCM did show Chinatown at their film festival this year, but Pulp Fiction was the opening night film, which a lot of people had a lot of opinions about. But honestly, if we're talking about noir, I mean, both of them kind of fit. You can't have one without the other, in my opinion. Hot take. But before we get to talking about Chinatown and LA Noir, we'd love to remind everybody that if you are not a member of our Patreon at patreon.com/ticklishbiz, then you should be. We do all sorts of additional content, including our bonus shows, doubled features, looking at remakes, based on a true podcast, looking at biopics and true crime, and our But Have You Read the series. We just laid out the entire rest of the year for bonus content, and we have some pretty fun stuff. Emily and I, including our long-awaited, and not by long-awaited, I mean just by me, double features episode looking at Death Takes a Holiday and Meet Joe Black. That movie is 3 hours, by the way. Didn't know that, but we're going to be watching it, so that'll be fun. We also give out regular care packages and movies and gifts and let you guest on an episode. It's at patreon.com/ticklishbiz. And don't forget that Emily and I are both authors. We have books out. We are writing books right now. You can order them wherever you buy books. And our Redbubble store has some fabulous art, all designed by Samantha Ellis and Terrence Hiltz, featuring your favorite stars, including our popular Makoko mugs. Somebody just bought our Basil Rathbone, I've Been Rathbone sticker, which, you know what, that to that person, I salute you. You can find that at ticklishbiz.redbubble.com. And don't forget, our entire archive, going all the way back to episode 1, is free over at Podbean. You can listen to that at ticklishbusiness.podbean.com. But enough plugs. Let's get into the episode. So we are talking about Chinatown. I'm going to try to succinctly tell people what the plot of Chinatown is.
Oh, that'll be longer than Meet Joe Black. Go, Kristen, go.
Exactly. So you have Jack Nicholson plays private detective J.J. Gittes, who is investigating a wealthy man There's double crossing. Faye Dunaway plays the wife of said wealthy man, but also the daughter of another. And it's about water issues. That's pretty much, I think, the most succinct way to sum it up. It's been utilized in numerous other movies as a plot point, including The Simpsons and The Lone Ranger. If you don't know that, The Lone Ranger is the plot of Chinatown. I'm not kidding. I wish I was, but you should go watch that 2013 disaster and tell me I'm wrong. I've seen Chinatown a couple times, and I feel like it's been hyped so much. It's one of those movies that, again, it's just been utilized in so many different other pieces of ephemera that when I finally saw it for the first time, I kind of knew the beats, the whole, my sister, my daughter type of thing. I already knew all that. But I think to actually see the performances, to see Jack Nicholson, to see Faye Dunaway, I mean, I understand why it's one of the great American movies of the time. Richard, do you remember seeing Chinatown for the first time? What are your thoughts about it at this point?
I think I was probably in college, which would have been about 10 years after it came out. I was too young to see it when it came into theaters, but I remember people talking about it. And Kristen, you make a great point. People know, forget it, Jake, it's Chinatown. And my sister, my daughter, they know, these certain beats, or they know the infamous, scene that's so hard to watch with the nose, and Roman Polanski, the director, playing the heavy there. So I probably was in college, taking film classes, and everything you say about it is so true. I think when you finally see it, and you're right, it's about water rights. It's about all the things film noirs are about. It's about a guy that's always looking out for himself, but then he decides finally to do the right thing. And of course, that almost never ends well in film noir, right? And corruption. It's interesting because they took the water rights story that really happened, I think, at the turn of the century and moved it into a 1930s setting, but had a lot of basis in reality and corruption. And you mentioned, of course, the leads. Faye Dunaway. When you think about Bonnie and Clyde and Chinatown and Thomas Crown Affair, I mean, she was the leading lady, in a lot of cases, the femme fatale. And Jack Nicholson, who I love, but there came a time with Jack Nicholson where he almost became a caricature of himself. I think Batman was when he finally said, "All right, this is me," And he's still wildly entertaining, and I love him in terms of endearment and all those films. But this goes back to that early film actor period of Jack Nicholson's career, where you're reminded of why he became a star in the first place is because he's a brilliant actor. He's not doing all the easy tricks in this. He really disappears into this character. I think that's one of the reasons why the film resonates 50 years later.
Emily, what about you? What's your background with this movie?
The first time I saw it was actually when I first moved to Los Angeles, because I'd gone to school in Boston, and then my college is well known for having an LA satellite campus. And so they went, let's teach you about film. You guys aren't paying attention. This is your last semester of senior year. So we're just going to teach you about LA film. And so that's when I first watched it, because they were like, here's your intro to Los Angeles with Chinatown. And then I also read, Ask the Dust and Day of the Locust and things like that, and watch those kinds of adaptations. So it was a very cynical way to introduce us to living in Los Angeles, but it was really, an incredibly educational experience. And then I've watched it a few times over the years since then. But this was my first time rewatching it after being someone who writes mystery novels and having just finished an LA noir mystery novel. So, and also after having lived in LA for 15 years. So this is a very new, fresh way of seeing a movie that I have seen many, many times. And it was really fun to pick up on all the tropes and all the characterizations that they use, and how he's pulling from multiple different detectives that have been very famous California detectives. And it was just a really interesting way for me to ingest this movie that is so well known. It's like the first time I watched The Godfather, where I was like, oh, okay, I see where this is originating now. You can know the end of Citizen Kane, and when you watch it for the first time, you're like, oh, that was great. Fantastic. I'm glad I didn't just rely on my knowledge of the ending, or kind of say lie and bluff your way through watching it. These are a couple of movies where you just say, no, you should actually sit down and watch Chinatown. You should actually sit down and watch this, and don't rely on your cynical, even though obviously noirs are very cynical, don't rely on your cynical idea of I know that movie already. No, sit down and watch this. It's much actually, I think, subtler than people give it credit for.
You make such a great point about returning to material. You know, when I was in like junior high school, they used to have a thing, I don't know if you guys remember, the Great Books Club, you know, where you would like, you know, the kids were, you know, if you had a real thing for reading and writing, like you guys obviously did, you know, your teachers would say, oh, we have a Great Books Club. You could read for fun. And we'll meet every Thursday. And, you know, you'd get A Tale of Two Cities and Moby Dick. And I think about it now and I'm like, you're 13. You know, I mean, if you, and it's great to read those books, but it's, to your point, Emily, it's like if you go back and reread a lot, you know, reread The Great Gatsby when you're 40, as opposed to when you read it in high school as part of an assignment, and it hits so differently. And it's the same thing with so many movies where, you know, you have certain memories of seeing it, maybe because you were in high school at the time, and sometimes they don't hold up. You know, sometimes you're like, oh, that's because I was 15 and I thought that kind of stuff was really funny, but, you know, I don't really need to revisit that. Or as Emily so eloquently put it, with something like Chinatown, you go back, and I've, you know, done the same thing, and you're like, wow. I mean, I think Jaws is the classic example of film, like not a film noir, but, you know, a film that you see it when you're 16, you're like, oh, that's scary, and oh wow, and then you go back and you're like, oh my God, the use of sound and this and that and all the little elements. So I think it's a great point about coming back and revisiting a film like Chinatown.
Well, and also, Emily brought up The Godfather. I mean, The Godfather 2 came out the same year as Chinatown. And I think that for me, Emily, I don't know if I'm putting words in your mouth, but for me as a person that nostalgizes Hollywood filmmaking of the 1970s and the 1990s to an extent too, which both of these eras were such examples of, you know, the raconteurs changing the Hollywood system. The studio system crumbled the decade before. 70s, you had a lot of the new upstarts that were making a lot of these movies. And what I read about Chinatown a lot is that it was kind of the death of the old Hollywood noir, the emphasis on, you know, you watch something like Out of the Past and the good guys triumph, or even somebody like Robert Mitchum, not to spoil Out of the Past for people, but I'm going to spoil Out of the Past if you haven't seen it. But even though Robert Mitchum's character tries to be a good man, he still gets punished at the end for his misdeeds. So there's always this sense of comeuppance. Good guys win, bad guys lose. And in a noir, the sexiness is always tempered with the harsh reality. And while that is still present in Chinatown, Chinatown is such a dark and cynical movie about the realities of what is actually going on in LA that it's often considered kind of the death of this myth of the noir as being this place of very clearly defined lines between good and bad. Everything is blurred in Chinatown, which I really appreciate. And when you go into some of like the production history of the movie, it does show you, I think, for me at least, why I love kind of the messiness of the Hollywood of the 1970s. Like this movie starts with Bob Evans, who was running Paramount at the time, offering, you know, Robert Towne $175,000 to write screenplay for The Great Gatsby, to bring that movie, which also came out that year. But Towne felt like, I can't do Fitzgerald justice. We can't make that any better. And so he asked Robert Evans to give him $25,000 to write Chinatown. The movie had such a fractious production history, and this was considered kind of Polanski's, you know, comeback in a way. And it really does illustrate why a lot of these household names, well, they were household names at the time. I don't know if most, you know, millennials like me or Gen Zers would even know who Robert Evans is or understand their impact. It's a great movie about nostalgizing of the past, but the story behind it also emphasizes to me now kind of the nostalgia of filmmaking, when, dare I say, filmmaking seemed a lot simpler.
You know, Kristen, it's interesting because you were saying that. I was thinking, you know, the behind the scenes stuff, you know, we had the mini series about the making of The Godfather. We've had, you know, books like Easy Rider, Raging Bulls. I don't know if anyone's ever going to do a mini series about the 2020 studio system with Ted Sarandos at the head of it. Oh, yeah. Like, no offense to Ted Sarandos, but I'm like, I don't know if it's got, because there are movie-like material behind the scenes. And I think you also make a great point about, you know, the ending of Chinatown and the cynicism and the darkness. and you think about where we were as a country in the 70s and the reason why movies like Chinatown, and then you had a spate of Vietnam War films that were very different from the World War II films. You had Coming Home and The Deer Hunter and Apocalypse Now. And even a movie like Blowout, you think of something like that. And, it was a very, dark time for the country. There was a recession and we were finally getting out of this war that had taken tens of thousands of lives that, majority of people thought we shouldn't have been in. When we finally came to that realization, we had a president resigning. You had all, the malaise. Jimmy Carter famously talked about the malaise in America. So I think the films from, the early 70s, as you mentioned, 1974, reflected that. Whereas in a lot of other eras, they'd be like, all right, how are we going to change the ending? We can't have this ending at Chinatown. He's going to save the day and ride off into the sunset. So I think, the films reflect the time and the times reflect the film. It's a little bit of each.
To look at something like Chinatown, which to get into the plot of the movie, I mean, J.J. Gittes is no Sam Spade or Philip Marlowe, who, Sam Spade and Philip Marlowe, Emily, I'm ready to hear Emily because she's the expert on this, in my opinion. But I mean, both of those characters are kind of ethically dubious. I think of something like The Big Sleep, which is one of my favorites. Also a movie that makes not a lick of sense, even to the author who wrote the book. But you watch that movie and the character is trying very hard to kind of get out of the situation, doesn't really want to get involved, and yet continues to be involved, and then you would get kind of the PIs of the 70s, famously like James Garner in the Rockford Files, who kind of epitomizes this kind of cool PI. One of my favorite noirs, talk about this more when we talk about our favorite LA noirs, but one of my favorite LA noirs is Harper with Paul Newman. And again, there's this coolness to a lot of these PIs. As the years go on, they eventually get, like, no disrespect to Jack Nicholson, but, Paul Newman, James Garner, like, they progressively get better looking. Like, the sexual allure becomes more of a thing. And what I appreciate about Jack Nicholson's character in this movie is that he starts out as such a venal character who doesn't really care about nuance or he just is in it for the money. And to watch his character slowly change into a human being, who does have the capacity to care for people, it's a very subtle kind of character arc. And I think that's what I appreciate about Town's scripts, is the ability to take characters that are fairly one note and craft them into 3D human beings, which is really great. I mean, but for me, no disrespect to Jack, but this is Faye's movie. And Faye has a documentary coming out. I'm hoping she talks about making this movie because she was treated pretty horribly while making it. By the time you get to that sequence between him and Roman Polanski and the nose thing, that's kind of the moment that this movie changes, because when you watch a 40s noir, sure, Robert Mitchum might get caught in a gunfight, but he always comes out unscathed, right? Sam Spade, Philip Marlowe, they come out unscathed. And the fact that this movie has that moment about midway through where he's got the Band-Aid on his nose, he's been physically cut, like, that's when you realize that all bets are off. Like, anything can happen. Anybody can die, even our hero. And I think that's, without making too much of a thing of it, ushers in this new idea of what the private eye film and the film noir can be. Emily, I don't know if you want to jump in with your insights, your expertise on the PI scene.
So while I was watching this and then afterwards reading up more on the details of how it was made and even why Robert Towne wrote it the way he did, was that he was inspired apparently by an article about Raymond Chandler's Los Angeles. And for me, it was really interesting because I really saw JJ as a very Sam Spade from the books analogous character. He's very smart. He's very quick-tongued. He can talk himself out of anything. Like when he walks into the reservoir and the cops are like, how'd you get in here? And he goes, to tell you the truth, I lied a little bit. And it doesn't stick to him. It just rolls right off of him like Teflon. That's very Sam Spade from the Maltese Falcon. And then you have him in Philip Marlowe's Los Angeles. And so for me, I really liked the fact that he doesn't seem to fit the LA he doesn't fit really in the world that he's in. They comment on the fact that he's wearing a really nice suit. They comment on the fact that like he's got staff which Philip Marlowe doesn't have in any of his books. He slightly too polished for the world that he's living in, which for me felt like they were taking Sam Spade, who's in San Francisco, and putting him in Los Angeles. And I really, really enjoyed that. But then I remembered, obviously, one of my favorite private detectives is the Continental Op, who is a guy who gets the absolute snot kicked out of him on a regular basis. It's quite the contrast to Sam Spade, who really in the Maltese Falcon doesn't really get, knocked about all that much. So I thought it was a really interesting amalgamation of those three guys whose stories took place in the 1930s. You have the Continental Op is, air quotes, too old for his doing. And throughout the stories, he reveals he's 35. And he's just like, I'm way too old for this. I shouldn't be doing this anymore. He's kind of getting bludgeoned half to death in every single one. And he wants to quit. And I feel like they kind of also gave JJ that impetus, that sort of like motive of, oh, now that it's affecting me physically, now that I've had an emotional attachment to this woman and it ends very, very poorly, I am too old for this game. So that was kind of how I read the character development through the lens of extremely famous California private detectives and the canon that is so like thoroughly being drawn from for this movie.
That's interesting, Emily. It reminds me of Danny Glover in the first Lethal Weapon, where he's 50 and they're all putting him out pasture, right? I'm too old for this bleep and everything. Mm-hmm. It's a great point about Nicholson's character, Jake, because we get some background like that. He was part of that world and he's elevated himself, right? As you mentioned, a little more dapper, and he's got a staff, and he's above that until he's not, because he gets dragged into the mud or the water, if you will.
And Emily and I did a whole series on The Thin Man last year. And I think it's also fun to watch this in contrast to that film where, Jack Nicholson has such a natural charisma and charm that he's kind of got that William Powell mien. He's good with the turn of phrase and all of that. But where Nick and Nora Charles are a unified front, they are a team. Both of these characters are, to kind of quote from Sweet Smell of Success, they're both mutual cookies dipped in arsenic. They are definitely toxic in that same way where you want Nick and Nora to go off happily ever after. These two, you just know from the get-go, like there is no happy ending for either of them.
It's such an interesting reflection on the studio system. These characters originated in the 30s. This movie is set in the 30s, but the movies they were actually making in the 30s were fun and laughy. William Powell and Myrna Loy dancing and drinking and having a good time. And it's like, oh, the wonderful psychological disconnect that America was going through.
That's, Emily, it's interesting too. I mean, obviously Chinatown's 1974, but so many film noir, of course, are from the 50s based on material from the 30s, because in the 40s, Hollywood kind of put everything aside for 5 or 6 years to do a lot of, I don't want to say propaganda, but, patriotic films. The stars themselves, in many cases, were in the military, and we had all these, until the best years of our lives, of course, we had, it was all just rah-rah and not cynical, even though they were probably cynical about making all those movies, of course. Then in the 50s, it's like, now where were we? Oh, yeah, let's go back to the dark side of Hollywood and LA.
Exactly. And I think people often forget the politicization of noir throughout the 1940s into the 1950s. I mean, we've seen shows nowadays talk about the creation of Los Angeles and the people that have been displaced, the whole towns that were essentially destroyed to craft the 405 or, various freeways in the country. And of course, this story is loosely based on William Mulholland and the creation of Los Angeles. And what is always funny to talk about, especially with people that try to describe Chinatown, is they forget the water rights element to it. They forget what that whole thing has to do with this movie. And it's often cited by, younger viewers as like, who really cares about that? But I've read some really fascinating books about the creation of Los Angeles, and 4 or 5 people that made billions and have their names splashed over every sign here because of what they created. And if you look at film noirs of the 1940s, some of them are noirish, but think of like something like Crossfire, which it was, when the book was written, it was about homosexuality, but in the movie it was anti-Semitism, but it's very noirish. You look at even something like In a Lonely Place, which is about Hollywood, but it's also about domestic abuse in a relationship. I mean, all of these movies have had some sort of subtext or historical element to them. And for me, somebody who gets to live in LA, I still have kind of those rose-colored glasses with everything where it's like, oh, just look at the history that you're stepping on. And this movie, again, just kind of really rips that dream apart, because it's like, yes, we love the history, we love the sparkle of Hollywood, but look at all of the stuff that got destroyed in order to make it. And I mean, just even watching Chinatown now is a time capsule, because so many of the locations where they filmed the movie are now gone, destroyed to build like a Gelson's or something. So it's that really interesting kind of meta turn of showcasing how everything that we love is really built on the bones of something else. LA really is kind of a graveyard of history because we just keep building on top of it.
Kristen, you mentioned, In a Lonely Place with the screenwriter and the aspiring actress, and of course Sunset Boulevard. Nobody can be more cynical about Hollywood than Hollywood when they finally do it then too. So there's this sort of dichotomy. Hey, we're this magical place. This is where all these amazing things happen. But also when you pull the curtain back, it's there's so much ugliness, and we're going to shine a mirror to that and put a light up to that.
I want to talk about Faye, because I love Faye in this movie. I mean, Richard, you brought up Faye Dunaway was probably the preeminent actress of the 1970s. It was just hit after hit after hit. We just did Mommy Dearest on our bonus series based on a true podcast, and that really is considered kind of the crunching halt to her career. I say wrongly so, but I know I'm in the minority there. To watch her in this, I mean, just the outfits, the costuming, she looks like a pure representation of the 1930s. You can easily just see Faye Dunaway playing opposite Myrna Loy if you really thought about it, if you had like a time machine. And she always was, I think, really great at playing kind of character out of time. And she's got this beautiful Anthea Silbert designed wardrobe that's going on here. She's just fantastic. But what I think more than anything, when we talk about kind of the tragedy of noir, it's often the men, right, that end up kind of paying the price. But I think that often forces us to forget how tragic a lot of the femme fatale characters are. I think of something like Postman Always Rings Twice, and Lana Turner's character, Cora, is a woman that just wants to better herself and wants more. And of course, that's perceived as bad. And yes, there's murder involved, but she ends up paying the price for it. And Evelyn's motivations are completely altruistic. She wants to protect her child from the horrific human being that abused her. We'll talk about the ending in a bit, but for me, the ending of the movie, I know we're supposed to feel that cynicism of the whole forget it, it's Chinatown, but for me, especially watching it again recently, knowing where her character ends up is where the true emotion always lies. Because especially as we've seen now in this post-Me Too world, so often we forget about kind of the litany of dead women in just film and reality. And Evelyn Mulwray is one of those real tragic figures that, I don't know how Faye just doesn't have so many Oscars at this point, because she's so good in the movie.
That's beautifully said, Kristen. When you're talking about Faye Dunaway too, there's certain actors and actresses, actors, if you will, that would be huge stars in any era. They have that sort of timeless quality. It's not just about the way they look, but I think when you were talking about Faye Dunaway, I was thinking of Jessica Chastain, like now. And you could see her in all these movies we're talking about. Plunker in a 1935 movie star. And Faye Dunaway, she, first of all, obviously, incredibly gorgeous, but such a good actor, as you mentioned. And you go back to something like, it's not a film noir, but Bonnie and Clyde's such an interesting film to me, because it's a great film, but they took the two most beautiful people in Hollywood and had them play the two worst people ever, and you kind of forget that because of these close-ups and all this stuff that, they were terrible people. They were, they killed all sorts of innocent people, and yet they became these anti-heroes. But to your point here in Chinatown, you're right. You think of something, you mentioned the Maltese Falcon, you have a lot of femme fatales who are up to no good and are being duplicitous and are taking these supposedly smart and sophisticated and worldly and cynical guys for a ride, or you can double indemnity, whatever the case may be. And in here, you make such a great point. She's not. And this goes back to what Emily says about going back and watching a film. Yeah, you can never have the experience of seeing a film for the first time. My friend you mentioned at the top of the podcast, Roger Ebert, always would say, if somebody, he never would make fun of someone for not having seen a movie, a great movie. If someone said, I've never seen Citizen Kane or The Godfather, he would say, I envy you the experience of seeing it for the first time. You're going to, it's going to be amazing. But rewatching a film and knowing certain things also adds so much to the experience, especially in something like Chinatown.
Exactly, yeah. And to watch Faye Dunaway's character, she goes through so many different levels. She starts out playing the cool femme fatale. When she has that first meeting with JJ and she talks about how she didn't hire him. She says something, I don't handle things, my lawyers do. It's a very cool, catty. You could see Barbara Stanwyck saying that line if this was the 1940s. But as the movie progresses and Town's script moves away from the stodginess of the studio era into the 1970s, you bring up Bonnie and Clyde, and that's such a unique, interesting juxtaposition because those characters are such anti-heroes and there is so much death, but everybody remembers the Theodore Van Ronkel, the berets and the outfit. It's like a lot like Scarface in that regard, where the air of cool permeates everything. But then you think of something like Network and Faye Dunaway in that, which is also just a very greasy look at television and cynicism. Have you become a Ticklish Biz patron yet? Well, you should. Just like Allie Moore, Amy Hart, Danny, David Floyd, Donna Hill, Gates, Jacob Haller, Jonathan Watkins, Krista Painter, Mick F., Rachel Clark, and Shawn Goodreau. Listen to episodes 48 hours early, watch exclusive video interviews, receive merch, and even guests on an episode. You also get access to bonus series like Based on a True Podcast, doubled features, and our latest series, But Have You Read? The Series. We're also giving away a massive prize pack to our 50th patron and doing a special theme in July that we've dubbed Don Johnson July. It all starts at $1 at patreon.com/ticklishbiz. Back to the show. Here, her character is just so tragic. And I'm always shocked at how overt the movie is in discussing the relationship that she had with her father is incest and it's abusive. And the movie doesn't shy away from that. Unlike in the 1940s, where that wouldn't have even been a talking point. That would have been completely changed. We would have had Claude Rains playing like her husband. We couldn't make him her dad or something like that, which honestly, you watch a lot of those 1940s movies and there are plenty of moments. I think of something like Claude Rains it's a Robert Mitchum movie with Faye Demure, and I don't remember what it's called right now. But the emphasis is that Faith Demure is his very young wife and he's Claude Rains. Robert Mitchum thinks he's her dad. That's kind of how this movie would have gone if it was in the 1940s. But I mean, just the whole trajectory her character takes is so shocking. And I know that a lot of people read Chinatown now they read it two ways, I think. A, it's hard not to watch this knowing that it's 1974. Roman Polanski kind of had to be pulled out to make this movie in the wake of losing his wife and his child in a very horrific public story. And then you watch it now and you look at it and you're, depending on how you feel about Roman Polanski as a person and a director, it's kind of hard not to separate art and artist. It's got layers. And I mean, not every movie has that ability to read it from multiple interpretations, unless you're really great, like a Citizen Kane, where you can just kind of keep reading it and every generation sees something different in it.
I was thinking of the Maltese Falcon and Kristen, your point about how certain things would just be, intimated. So you have the Peter Lorre character of Joel Pyro and there's at one point like his business card and they say something about smells of lilac or something like that. You're like, oh, okay, gotcha, we got it. And it's so fun to go back and look at so many films, not so much from the 70s as you mentioned, but especially from the 40s and 50s, and how certain things just have to be hinted at. And I don't remember, it was one of the great directors from that period saying, they would put all these things in there, and then you had the board, the censors or whatever you want to call them, and they were all these kind of right wing, a lot of times Catholic, and they'd put them in there and they'd say, well, some people on the board would be afraid to say they noticed it, because then they'd be like, what are you noticing there? We didn't even intend that. What's going on in your sick mind? So they sometimes would just let things go through because they didn't want to admit that they had noticed it while they were looking at these films.
Town kind of played with the ending a lot while he was writing it. I do want to point out really briefly that I mentioned Faye Dunaway did not have an easy time with this movie. Supposedly her and Polanski just did not get along at all. There was a lot of playful jokes on his part that I think now, in a post like Me Too world, we'd be like, that's not really appropriate. I think like the one story I always remember is that she asked him what was her motivation for the scene, and he was like, just fucking act. Like, that's your motivation. Think of the money. That's what your motivation is. And I'm just like, okay, which again is interesting because, the method was such a big part of acting in the 1950s, particularly for men. But we don't often remember how many women were method. And method means something so different in the 1950s than it does today. But, Marilyn Monroe, very famously kind of a method performer. But I always find that story funny because the fact that her character has to undergo so much trauma on screen, and the fact that she was allegedly going through a lot of trauma off screen too, is again a testament to her ability as a performer, that she's able to sell it, which I appreciate.
The underlying characteristic of her on screen always, but especially in this movie, is dignity. And she has this incredible, because of the way she looks, where she walks in and her main confrontation at the house where she's just been writing, and Jake knows he's kind of catching her in something that's hinky, something he's first starting to sniff that something is afoot. And she has this unbelievable, cool, blonde, rich bitch air to her, where she just like takes off the gloves and she's in full, I'm in Connecticut right now, she's just in full country white person attire. And you're just like, oh, what is she up to here? How is she getting her fingers dirty? How is this going to sully this blonde woman? And she goes through almost every archetype of like how movies treat blonde women throughout like the entire movie. She's haughty and wealthy when she walks into his office, hears him tell a dirty joke, and she's above it, and she's not even going to acknowledge that she heard the dirty joke. Next thing is she's in a mansion and she owns horses and has tons of Chinese servants working around her. And you think, oh, this is another aspect of white womanhood that she's doing. And then slowly, and then all of a sudden she's sleeping with Jake, and you're like, oh, this is another thing that white women do on screen, that like now she's doing the next thing. Now she's doing the next bit of manipulation. She's flirting with him, even though her husband just died. What is happening here? And then by the end, you get this incredible breakdown, because she's not, the reason why she's hiding what happened to her is not because she's necessarily ashamed of what happened to her. She just doesn't want her daughter to know her background. And then you have this incredible moment of strength where she's being slapped and repeatedly and hard. And she's having the moment where she's like, I'm finally going to have to verbalize what is happening here. And that's why she's breaking down. And then so finally she tells, I'm her mother and her sister, this big crying lie, the truth has to come out. And one of the things that floored me while watching it this time, and forgive me, I'm going to have to use the word, but Jake's response is, he raped you? And the fact that they actually used the word threw me for a loop. I was waiting for these kind of like sleight of hand or like fake way of discussing
the
crime to happen. And she says, yes. And that is such an incredible piece of writing that happened for both of these people to have the equalizing moment where she has to finally verbalize, where her daughter might overhear what happened, her worst nightmares coming through. And he's having a realization of these beautiful, rich people have all of this mess. And in the meantime, her Chinese servants she never speaks down to them. She never abuses them. She does not treat them poorly. And in a way, they're the closest thing she has to a support system and family, even though, James Hong they're doing typical Chinese accents throughout the whole thing. So it's a little bit uncomfortable to watch now in 2024, but they have a very loving, supportive relationship. And for me, that was just an incredibly interesting place to put this climax, this denouement of this movie, of where they're all outsiders, but she's been allowed in ways that like other people, and the way that Jake and the police lieutenants can't understand.
Yeah, that's so well said, and you're right about that scene. That's the 1974-ness of Chinatown, where they can handle it in a way.
Yeah.
And, Kristen, you got me thinking of something. We were talking about the treatment of Faye Dunaway, and it just caused something about, The Godfather actually has a film noir about Hollywood within the first Godfather. When you go back and think about it, that whole plot about how he won't give the Jack Woltz, the producer, who was a monster, by the way, and when he finally gives the speech explaining why he's never going to give the part to this guy they want to have, the Sinatra-esque character, it's because he groomed and was a predator of a young actress, and then he says this other guy ruined her. We never see her, but talk about a cynical look at Hollywood, where they literally just throw away this young woman. She's not even in the movie, but she's the heart of this whole dispute. Talk about a cynical look at the way Hollywood works.
Yeah, and I think that's what's always interesting, the look back at Hollywood's been telling on itself for a long time, and it's always interesting to see it played out. But Emily, to go what you were talking about with Faye, again, that has a classic film element to it. Kay Francis played so many women who either had to abandon a child or give a child up for various reasons, or in some instances, she does actually have a movie where she is pretend playing the sister of her own child for reasons. I think Kay tended to be more like vanity reasons, like she doesn't want to look like a mother and be an actress type of thing. But all of that, again, Robert Towne just must have had an expansive film knowledge because he's really drawing on so much. In case anybody was curious, this movie was nominated for 11 Oscars, only won one for Robert Towne's screenplay, which is still shocking to me. Faye Dunaway was nominated alongside Ellen Burstyn for Alice Doesn't Live Here Anymore, Diane Carroll for Claudine, Jenna Rollins for A Woman Under the Influence, and Valerie Perrine for Lenny. I mean, that's a pretty stacked deck. Every one of those women is fantastic. Does anybody remember who won?
Ellen Burstyn, I think.
Yes, you are correct. Ellen Burstyn did win. And I have to say, Alice Doesn't Live Here Anymore, I think, is the one movie I have not seen of Scorsese's oeuvre. So I cannot comment on whether I'm upset about that or not. But honestly, I mean, I think any one of those women, that's one of the few years where I can say anybody that it won would have been fantastic because all of them are amazing. But it's always shocking to me that this movie got so many nominations and really didn't end up going home with more than one of them, which, I mean, either it's a testament to how fantastic 1974 was, or I don't know, maybe it was just too cynical, which is shocking. We got to talk about the biggest old Hollywood connection to this movie, which is John Huston, who plays Noah Cross, which is Evelyn's father and abuser. And I think that I would love to show this to like a Gen Zer or somebody that has never seen it, because I think what's always shocking to me is how John Huston kind of weaponizes that old Hollywood allure for his performance until Evelyn kind of manifests and verbalizes what has happened. He comes off as kind of this curmudgeonly, like old guard example of old Hollywood. And I think too, we talk about how powerful persona was, especially in the studio era, but it continues to this day in many ways. Certain actors do not like to go against the persona that they have. And I mean, to watch this movie, knowing that John Huston was considered one of the few remaining old Hollywood directors who had been in the trenches, had birthed actors, his family was still working, and to play just the most horrific human being. I would love to see how surprised somebody who's never seen that movie would be. But then again, I think they would also have to know the Huston factor of it all, which I don't know how many young people know that these days. It's very interesting to me. It's one of many things I think about. But I want to talk about the ending, because I feel like at this point we've just danced around it. So if you don't want to know the ending of Chinatown, we don't usually give spoiler warnings, but again, if you have not seen this, I'll give a spoiler warning. So the end of the movie does culminate with the revelation about the incest. We find out a lot of other things, but essentially Gittes arranges for Evelyn and her daughter to flee to Mexico, because essentially what Noah Cross wants is his granddaughter child. They're supposed to meet up. You find out too that Noah Cross is involved in the water rights issue, and you find out that he also murdered Evelyn's husband, who found out about all of this. They all meet up. The police are there. Of course, Noah Cross decides to approach his child and identifies himself as her grandfather. And Evelyn understandably gets very upset. And the two decide to flee. There's a gunfight, and Evelyn is shot in the ensuing police battle and is killed, leading to Noah Cross walking off into the darkness with his grandchild. And that is how the movie ends, with the culmination of the famous line, "Forget it, Jake, it's Chinatown." It's probably, I'm sure, Richard, you could tell me there's a bleaker, blacker ending in film history, but for me, this is like the just gut punch of this movie. Noah Cross wins. We don't know what is going to happen to this poor girl, but we know it's probably not going to be good. And I think that that's what, talk about, like you were talking about, kind of ways that Hollywood has been telling on itself. Like the fact that the old man with power gets to walk off into the proverbial sunset. It's such a painful ending. I just, every time I'm always shocked by how they just went for that.
Yeah, it's so bleak. And I got chills just as you were describing it, Kristen, because the monster wins. And I don't know. The first movie I thought of, it's got nothing to do with noirs, The Mist. If people haven't seen The Mist,
right?
The last 5 minutes of that is like, one. Are you kidding me?
That's the one.
Endings. But the ending of The Omen is upbeat compared to the ending of Chinatown.
Right?
It really is. But I think one of the reasons why Kristen and Emily were talking about this movie 50 years later is because of that uncompromising, bleak, dark ending. If you had some sort of traditional gunfight or, rescue thing, it's Thelma and Louise, I guess, is another one where we talk about it so much. It's so good leading up to that. But then it's like, and you have to admire the people who made the film from Town Screenplay. And I'm sure there must have, you probably know this, Kristen and Emily, there must have been a lot of discussions about the ending. We're not going to do this, and listen, this was not a huge hit. We should also point that out. It is not, I don't know if it's a huge hit now, but it's a universally acknowledged classic, but it wasn't, this huge box office sensation. That might be one of the reasons why it didn't win the Oscars, because of course, especially then, those two things went so hand in hand.
Well, it's interesting, too. The ending was not what Robert Towne wanted. It actually led to a huge falling out between him and Polanski, because Towne wanted Noah Cross to die and for Evelyn to live. And they argued about it really, really heavily. And Polanski ultimately said, and I'm quoting here from TCM, he said, quote, "I knew that if Chinatown was to be special, not just another thriller where the good guys triumph in the final reel, Evelyn had to die." And they ended up parting ways. Polanski ended up writing the ending. And it's ironic that Towne won the Oscar for the script with an ending that he did not write and he did not like. But I don't ever want to agree with Polanski on anything, but I agree with him on this, in the sense that we talk about Chinatown as the death of the old Hollywood noir. And what is the ultimate way of showing that? And that is a character that has ultimately been victimized and abused, tragically dying, having done nothing. You know, like her act is ultimately in vain. And I know the film ends on, you know, JJ Gittes, his face realizing, like, what the hell is the world coming to right now? But for me, I'm like, I don't really care how you feel right now. I care about the fact that this woman has spent her life trying to give her child some type of normalcy, and it is all in vain. You know, I've had some people, I've talked about the ending of Chinatown with some people. It's always interesting, the people that try to rationalize a happy ending, you know, that are like, well, you know, Cross is dying. He wants to leave something, you know, for his you know, legacy. Like, it's about the legacy of the name and all of that. I'm like, I find it funny that some people do have to rationalize kind of a happy ending, because I think the reality of the ending is just too hard for some people to parse, of like, no, any perceived monetary or financial benefit, which is essentially what Evelyn is against. It doesn't matter how much money she could be getting or the lifestyle to which she has. Like, that doesn't make up for any of it. And that's certainly not what she wants her child to have as well.
There are two things in the ending that I noticed now more than I did the first couple of times I watched it. And one of them is the girl, Catherine, is having just an absolute screaming, hysterical reaction to seeing her mother get killed. And totally understandable. She's a teenager. She's very, very young. And I noticed for the first time that the way John Huston approaches the scene is that he grabs her around the waist and puts his hand over her mouth. And that is just one of the most viscerally sickening things I've ever seen on screen, even though it is entirely not violent. It's incredibly violent at the same time. And then the other thing that I like to talk about quite a bit as someone who now writes PI novels is that one of the things that goes hand in hand with using a private investigator, or even writing a cozy that doesn't go along with if your cop is your hero, is that there is an understanding that these are regular people pursuing justice. They don't have a badge. They don't have any special powers bestowed to them by society. They are just people who are, even though they are cynical about it, they are spurred on by justice. And it's such an interesting ending for Jake to see the fact that no matter how much he wants justice, no matter how much he works and even sacrifices himself, it is not going to happen. And I cannot imagine Chinatown with an ending where Jake gets to be the hero. Like, it's not, I can't imagine it at all.
Emily, to your point too, you know, if you look at so many of these noirs and go all the way to something like LA Confidential, or even, I think Kristen mentioned the Rockford Files, the police so often are either, obstructionist or purely corrupt, you know, in a lot of cases too, which is another thing about LA looking at itself when you think about that.
I do want to throw out some other LA noirs that we love, both classic and contemporary. I mentioned Harper, which is a really fun one. Not at all like Chinatown. It's actually, I would say, fairly peppy compared to this. It's from 1966, and I love Paul Newman in this movie. It's got a great cast. I mean, Lauren Bacall's in it, and Julie Harris, Janet Leigh, everybody. Robert Wagner playing a character that might be coded as gay, you know. And it's a very fun look at LA in the swinging 60s. There's a whole like bizarre kind of like moon comet type of cult nature to it. It's a lot of fun. I think it's great. And then if we're going classic, Richard, you mentioned LA Confidential. I cannot stress how much I love LA Confidential. It's up there with Chinatown for me in terms of like, if you're looking at classic and contemporary looks at LA noir, and yet both of them are period pieces. It's fantastic. My one criticism as a Veronica Lake fan is that, you know, Kim Basinger don't look like Veronica Lake. She got the hairstyle, yeah, but she's too tall. Veronica Lake was 4'11". This woman, no offense to Kim, but she is built like a linebacker compared to very tiny little Veronica Lake. She looks more like Rita Hayworth to me, but it's great. I love it so much. Emily, what are some other LA noirs that you love?
Even though I love the book, I will actually say something entirely heretical, that I think The Long Goodbye is better than the book.
Okay.
And I know that's going to get me a lot of flack, but I think Altman's Long Goodbye is absolutely just a flawless LA noir movie. Elliot Gould's so good in it. He's so dirty and put upon. Absolutely wonderful look at LA. And then as for a comedy movie that I don't think is good cinema, but I think it's a great movie, I will say that I think one of my favorite LA crime noir movies is Get Shorty. That's
a fun one.
And it's so LA, and it's one of those things where it's like, it's not cinema by any means, but man, that is a rollicking good LA movie.
That's
Richard?
Funny. Yeah, that's great, Emily. I just rewatched that, and you're so right about that. I also agree about The Long Goodbye. I think that's a case of actually moving the setting to the present day of the time, the 70s, in other words, was a great choice. I think The Grifters is another one that holds up really well, with Angelica Houston and of course John Cusack, and at the very top, Kristen, you mentioned Pulp Fiction, and I guess some people call it like sun noir. These films that are noir but mostly set during the daytime, but that also brings about the great contrast between the magic and the sunniness and the reason why so many people go to LA and move to LA, and the darkness that's happening just behind in that apartment, in that bar, and in that pawn shop, whatever the case may be.
As somebody who's seen Pulp Fiction twice in 2 months, I agree with you on that. We got some comments about this topic on social media, and I'll read them in a second. But I did want to, before we close out on Chinatown, it was nominated for Best Picture. And again, we talk about just the stacked deck in 1974. But the nominees for Best Picture that year were Chinatown, Lenny, Godfather 2, The Conversation, and The Towering Inferno. One of these things is not like the other. But does anybody remember what won?
I think it was Godfather 2, wasn't it?
Yes, it was. First sequel to ever win an Oscar, which honestly, fair.
To your point though, too, sorry, but that The Towering Inferno, that's because there was still that old Hollywood, you see pictures like in the late 60s, like Oliver, getting all these Oscar accolades.
It's the Dr. Dolittle of the whole thing. Yeah. Yeah, gotta love how long that stuck around. In terms of we did get some other responses to our LA Noir question via social media. Thank you to everybody that answered our question, but I will read a couple of them. Of course, our friend Terrence Hilt at Cooler K Hilt said, my favorite LA set noir would probably be In a Lonely Place, which, yes, that's true. If you want to hear our thoughts on In a Lonely Place, we did talk about that with Eddie Muller, of all people. So you should go listen to that episode. Our friend Chris Yogurst at Chris Yogurst said, too many to list. One that needs more attention is He Walked by Night. Yes, that is true. A personal favorite of the well-known LA noirs for him, though, is Sunset Boulevard. Very true. At Break a Brain said, Mulholland Falls, not Drive, Falls. He never saw Mulholland Drive. Good, but quite dark. The Nice Guys is a great noir comedy. It's both a parody and a great entry into the genre. We didn't even mention, Shane Black just knows LA noir very well. Kiss Kiss Bang Bang is another really good one. So good. At Caesar Gonzalez 3M said, I'll chip in with two modern ones, The Long Goodbye and The Grifters, both of which we already mentioned. Plus, you can't beat the batshit LA craziness of Kiss Me Deadly. That's very true. And then Jeffrey at Jeff Lynn W4646, why LA Out of the Past is my favorite, his number one favorite. So Out of the Past is great. Thank you to everybody who submitted answers. I think we all agree Chinatown, must watch. Utterly fantastic movie. But Richard, I want you to give us the last word. What do you think about Chinatown? Do you recommend it?
Absolutely. And again, going back to that point that Roger Ebert made, if you haven't seen it, I do envy you that first time. But you guys got me, even though I just recently rewatched it, I think I have to watch it again now because you guys are so amazing with all the points you've made. I'm going to see it in a whole new light again.
Yay! We try. But
see.
Listeners, let us know what you think of Chinatown, LA Noir, John Huston being horrible. You can send them to us at ticklishbiz@gmail.com or send them to us on all social media platforms at either ticklish_biz on Twitter and ticklishbiz everywhere else. We'd love to thank Richard Roeper once again for sitting down and chatting with us. It's such a pleasure to have you on. Finally, I've been saying I'm going to get you on for months, and I finally did it. Richard, where are you on the interwebs? Feel free to let listeners know anything you got coming up.
Yeah, of course, on Twitter, it's at Richard E. Roeper. And my print reviews are, I'm still with the Chicago Sun-Times. I've been, we got to say this very quickly. The Chicago Sun-Times has had 2 film critics in 60 years, the great Roger Ebert, and I'm just trying to, do my best to carry on the legacy. So suntimes.com, you can get all my print reviews there.
Awesome. That's going to close out Ticklish Business for today. You can listen to us wherever you get podcasts, on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, wherever you listen to shows like these. We did get our first review of 2024 over on Apple Podcasts. It's from at Stanny2401K, who headlines their review with smart talk about the movies we love. It's always a good time when you share that with other folks who love movies and can talk intelligently about them. The episodes on this year's TCM Fest were informative and got me excited about attending. Thanks. Well, we hope to meet you in person at the TCM Fest next year. I hope Emily is at the TCM Fest next year.
Oh, fingers crossed I will be back in Los Angeles and I will be sitting next to you watching the movies.
We also didn't give a shout out to, if you want to learn more about Chinatown, our friend Sam Wasson wrote the definitive book about it called The Big Goodbye, Chinatown, The Last Years of Hollywood. We hope to get Sam on soon. He could not be on this one because he's writing another book because he is amazing. But definitely give his book a read if you want to learn more about some of the stuff we were only just able to touch on in this episode. We love reviews, as you can tell, so please leave us one wherever. That I found out Spotify does reviews now, so you don't want to leave us a review on Apple because you don't use it. That's fine. Leave us one on Spotify. You can follow the podcast on all social media, as I mentioned. Once again, we're at ticklish_biz on Twitter, and then Facebook, Instagram, and TikTok at ticklishbiz. You can always follow me over at KristenKLopez.com, which is my official website. I also have a Substack called Kristamania that has movie reviews and just weird things that I want to write about. That's at kristenlopez.substack.com. And I'm on all social at kristenlopez88. Emily, where are you online? What's going on over in your neck of the woods?
I have a really unused website over at MsEmilyEdwards.com, where hopefully I will remember to write things on a more frequent basis. But if you'd like to find me, I'm across social media, mostly on Instagram and Blue Sky now at also Ms. Emily Edwards.
And we do have an equally underutilized website where you can read reviews and whatnot. That's at ticklishbiz.com. You can also follow us on Patreon, which helps keeps the lights on and gives us chances to do all sorts of new content. We have a poll going on right now to vote on our International Month movie for July. Your choices are between Kind Hearts and Coronets, the British film, I think The Umbrellas of Cherbourg, the French film with Catherine Deneuve, and La Strada, which is Italian and showed at the TCM Classic Film Festival. That is for free and paid patrons. So if you just want to sign up for free to vote, you can totally do that. That's at patreon.com/ticklishbiz. And Emily and I are authors. You can read my book, but have you read the book wherever you get books, as well as Emily's Viviana Valentine series. Please buy them. It helps us get motivation to keep writing the next books. We will be back with a new episode soon. Till then.